Clara James had stopped expecting surprises a long time ago. At 42, she lived the kind of life that didn't require a calendar. Each night, precisely at 10 p.m., she tied on her apron at Becker's 24-hour bakery, flipped the open sign under flickering fluorescent lights, and settled into the hum of ovens and the loneliness that always came after midnight. Her town, Beaver Falls, Wisconsin, wasn't known for much, just pine trees, quiet streets, and winters that hung like burdens. She walked to work wrapped in a green coat with a broken zipper. Her thermos of lukewarm coffee was always in her hand, the same as every night. There was a hole in the left thumb of her glove that she never bothered to mend. Routine was a kind of comfort, even if it numbed more than it warmed. She rarely spoke of her past, not the nursing classes she never finished, not the miscarriage that ended a marriage, not the brother who hadn't written since he left for Nevada in 2006. Those were parts of a different Clara, one she rarely acknowledged, except on long walks home when the silence grew thick enough to hear her own memory. The night of the storm started like the others. A wind howled against the bakery windows, and the snow fell sideways, making the street outside vanish in white. Even the regulars stayed home. By midnight, only one loaf of bread remained on the shelf. Clara knew that loaf, it had a small crack on the top from being left in the oven a minute too long. She didn't expect it to sell. She was wiping down the counters when the door creaked open. A man stepped inside, carrying the storm with him. His military jacket was soaked through, salt lines staining the cuffs. His boots left puddles where he stood. His face, gaunt and unshaven, looked like it had forgotten how to ask for help. He didn't speak. Just walked up to the counter, placed a trembling hand into his pocket, and poured a handful of change onto the glass. Quarters, nickels, a single dime, and a few tarnished pennies. He counted them with fingers that looked like they hadn't felt warmth in days. Clara could tell before he finished, he didn't have enough. Not even close. She didn't say anything. Her hands moved on instinct, wrapping the loaf in butcher paper like it had already been purchased. She slid it toward him gently. He stared at it for a second, as if unsure it was real, then looked at her with eyes that carried more weight than words ever could. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. He simply turned, the bread pressed to his chest, and walked back into the night. The door clicked shut behind him, and the storm swallowed him whole. Clara stood still for a long time, watching through the fogged window. Her coworker, Rhonda, made a comment about giving away food to strays. Something sharp and dismissive. Clara said nothing. She was used to silence being the loudest language. Outside, the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy sheets, and the footprints the man had left were already vanishing. When her shift ended, Clara stepped out into the storm, the thermos warm against her side. She walked the 12 blocks home, snow crunching beneath her boots. Her apartment sat above the old thrift store, next to a shuttered movie theater no one had bought. She climbed the narrow stairs, unlocked the creaky door, and entered the stillness. A small lamp by the window cast a weak glow on the floor. She poured water into a chipped glass, the same one she used every night, and sat at the small kitchen table. To her, the gesture at the bakery had been small. A forgotten kindness. Just a loaf of bread. It hadn't felt like a turning point or a headline. It didn't feel like anything at all. But sometimes, when the world is quietest, it's listening the most. Unseen, unnoticed, something had shifted. And far beyond the window, past the empty theater, past the fading footprints and frozen roads, engines were starting. Clara was still asleep when the first sound came. A low growl that rumbled beneath the wind. At first, she thought it was the old radiator again, the one that clanged like a hammer in the night. But this was different. This was heavier, rhythmic, alive. The kind of noise that carries purpose. She turned over in bed, the covers wrapped around her like a cocoon, and tried to ignore it. Outside, the sky was still dark, though a faint blue now traced the horizon. Morning was coming. Then the windows began to tremble. Clara sat up, heart pacing with that strange, premonitory thud that only occurs when something is about to change. She moved to the window, parting the curtain with one finger. What she saw didn't make sense, not at first. Parked outside her building, engines idling in neat formation, were 3 military vehicles. One bore the faded black mark of a convoy carrier. The others looked newly painted, their hoods still glistening with melting snow. Uniformed men and women stood on her sidewalk, boots planted, breath curling in the winter air. Neighbors peeked through curtains, cell phones already lifted. The bakery across the street hadn't even opened yet, but the town was awake, stirred by something too large to ignore. A knock sounded on her door. Clara hesitated, then opened it to find a soldier standing there, clean-cut, solemn, and holding a sealed envelope. The Department of Defense seal gleamed in the soft hallway light. He handed it to her with a respectful nod. No explanations. No words. Clara closed the door gently and sat down at the table, the same chipped glass from last night still beside her. She stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The paper inside was thick, official, and bore the weight of more than just words. The man she had helped, it said, was Joel Sanders, a former Marine, honorably discharged, recipient of multiple commendations. He had served 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. In recent years, however, he had slipped from the system's view, swallowed by depression and the slow erosion of purpose that sometimes follows war. He had wandered from town to town, avoiding shelters, avoiding people. The letter continued in precise language. That night in the bakery, he had been walking with a decision in his heart. Not for food. Not for comfort. Just one last human moment before disappearing completely. But her gesture, the unspoken kindness of that small loaf, had interrupted the silence that had consumed him. He hadn't gone far after leaving the bakery. Instead, he turned back toward the military base he had once avoided. He walked 5 miles through the storm until he reached the gate. When they found him, he was clutching the bread to his chest like a keepsake. He asked for help. For the first time in almost a year, he said he wanted to live. The letter bore the signature of General Thomas Sanders, retired. His father. The final paragraph requested her presence at the base, where an official commendation would be presented. Her name would be entered into the civilian honor registry for acts of unprovoked moral courage. Clara folded the letter slowly, her hand steady despite the whirlwind outside. She looked again out the window. The neighbors were no longer pretending not to look. Phones flashed. Children clutched coats. Rhonda from the bakery stood outside in her slippers, mouthing something that Clara couldn't hear. It didn't feel real. It felt like someone else's story. An hour later, a soldier returned to escort her. No sirens, no announcements. Just a quiet ride in the back seat of a long, black military sedan. The base was 30 miles from town, but the journey felt shorter. Snow covered the hills in soft layers, and the world looked like it had been paused. At the base, she was led to a small auditorium, bare walls, a flag, and rows of chairs filled with uniformed men and women. A podium stood at the front, behind it a tall man in formal dress blues. Clara recognized the eyes instantly. The man at the podium was Joel's father. General Sanders spoke not of policy or medals, but of the space between people. Of the war fought not in deserts, but in the minds of those who come home. He spoke of his son, not just a Marine, but the man who, for months, had been unreachable. Until one night, a stranger reached him with nothing more than a loaf of bread and no questions asked. He turned toward Clara and paused. This commendation, he said, is not for heroism in the traditional sense. It is for something rarer. It is for the strength to be gentle. For courage without recognition. For the kind of human act that cannot be ordered, only chosen. A civilian honor medallion was placed into Clara's hand. The applause that followed was respectful, not thunderous. But it carried weight. She spoke only once. Her voice was clear, but quiet. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't want him to be hungry. Then she stepped back, medal in hand, and sat in the front row as if she were no different than anyone else in the room. Outside the base, the convoy waited to return her home. The town stood waiting, uncertain now, their earlier curiosity tempered by something closer to reverence. By midday, the snow had slowed. But the silence that followed her home said more than words ever could. By the time Clara returned to Beaver Falls, the snow had softened into a quiet drizzle of flakes, gentle now, as though the storm itself had been calmed. The military convoy had peeled away 2 streets before her apartment, silent, respectful. No sirens, no ceremony, just an unmarked sedan easing to a stop beside the bakery. Clara stepped out, medal still tucked into her coat pocket. No one had asked for a speech, and she hadn't offered one. She walked with the same gait, carried the same thermos. But something had shifted, not in her, but in the air around her. Becker's 24-hour bakery didn't open again that night. Not right away. Rhonda called in early, saying she needed time to process everything. She'd seen the medal, heard the speech. Now she wasn't sure how to look Clara in the eye. By morning, the newspaper had already run a front-page story, "Bakery Worker Saves Marine with Loaf of Bread." The article was short, but the words lingered. Words like selfless and honor, foreign to Clara's world of registers and receipts. She didn't answer her door when the first reporters knocked. She didn't respond to emails from national outlets asking for interviews. She didn't have a website or social media to direct them to. What would she say, anyway? That she wrapped a loaf and gave it away because it felt like the only decent thing left to do that night? But still, the story spread. First through the county, then the state. Veterans groups shared it. Military families reposted it. Churches and community centers printed it on newsletters. Letters began arriving, folded paper with shaky handwriting and tear-stained corners. Some simply said thank you. Others shared their own stories of lost sons, forgotten spouses, and the thin line between despair and hope. Clara read them all. She kept them in a shoebox beneath her bed, beside old photos and utility bills. Each morning, she added the newest ones, placing them gently as if they were breakable. Back at the bakery, changes began to appear without planning. A handwritten sign appeared one morning by the register, "Veterans served with respect." We remember. Clara hadn't written it, but she didn't remove it either. Rhonda returned with a yellow ribbon pinned to her apron. A small American flag appeared in the corner by the door. Customers started leaving larger tips. Some shook Clara's hand. Some simply nodded and pressed folded bills into the jar. Others, perhaps unsure of what to say, said nothing, but returned more often, bringing friends, telling stories. One afternoon, a boy no older than 10 sat at the same counter stool for an hour, his backpack beside him. When Clara asked if he was waiting for someone, he only said, "My dad said this place is safe." He never ordered. Just drank a glass of water and watched the snow fall. Veterans began returning to places they had quietly avoided, cafes, town hall meetings, church potlucks. A subtle shift passed through Beaver Falls, not loud or dramatic, but steady. A town once used to turning away now looked inward. By the end of the month, the local VFW chapter launched an initiative called One Loaf, One Story. They started collecting personal accounts from veterans across the county, moments of kindness, loss, reconnection. Each story began the same way, "The day someone noticed me." Clara was invited to the first gathering. She declined at first, but later stood quietly in the back, watching as others stepped up to share. A woman read a letter her husband had written before deploying. A man in his 70s spoke about being called broken by his own family. A teenager described how her father, once silent at dinner, now spoke about the men he lost. Every story held the thread of being unseen, until someone looked. No one introduced Clara. No one needed to. They all knew. On the sidewalk outside the bakery, a plaque was installed in early spring. It bore no name, just a simple line etched into brass. A single act of kindness is never truly small. The mayor had approved it. The town council had funded it. But no one claimed credit. Clara passed by it each night on her way in. She never stopped to read it. She didn't need to. She was already living it. She didn't hang her medal in the bakery. It stayed in a drawer beneath her sink, next to the old church programs and expired coupons. Sometimes she touched it when reaching for batteries or tape. She never took it out. The bakery's bread never changed, still the same cracked loaves and lopsided rolls, but people said it tasted better now. Warmer. Like it carried something more than flour and yeast. On a Tuesday evening, a group of high school students came in after a memorial ceremony at the park. They left a folded note and a small photo beside the tip jar. It showed a young man in uniform, smiling with sun in his eyes. The note read, "He made it home. Thank you for reminding us how much that matters." Clara didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply turned, filled the coffee pots again, and resumed her shift. The town had changed. Not because of a speech, or a parade, or a newspaper story, but because someone once gave something they could afford to lose, a loaf of bread, and expected nothing in return. The wind had lost its bite by the time Joel Sanders returned to Beaver Falls. It was exactly 26 days after the snowstorm, the one Clara James would never forget, even though she still told herself she hadn't done anything remarkable. The calendar on the bakery wall still showed the previous month, and the thermos on her counter still bore the same dent. Life, for the most part, continued with its familiar rituals. But beneath those routines, a quiet current had begged *N to move. That afternoon, Clara was placing fresh rolls into the glass display when the bell above the door rang, not sharp, not hurried, just the soft chime of someone not trying to be seen. She looked up and knew immediately. He stood straighter now. His jacket was new. The boots no longer carried slush but polish, and though his eyes still held shadows, they were not the same eyes that had come in from the storm. In his hand, he held a small paper bag. Clara didn't say a word. She simply nodded toward the same stool he had hovered beside weeks ago. He sat down, gently placing the bag on the counter between them. From it, he withdrew 2 items, a combat medal, dark bronze with worn edges, and a letter folded in thirds, the kind kept in a pocket long enough to soften its creases. He pushed both toward her, hand steady now. The medal was one earned for valor under fire, a commendation that once meant survival, sacrifice, and service. But Joel had come to believe that bravery wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like a woman in a bakery, wrapping the last loaf without asking for names. The letter was simple, written in strong handwriting. It said that this medal had traveled through 3 wars, seen blood, heat, and noise. But now it belonged to someone who had saved a life not with armor or orders, but with the only *P*N that couldn't be trained, compassion. Clara didn't cry. She didn't decline. She placed the medal gently back into the bag and carried it to the back room. There, she tucked it beside the shoebox of letters and the folded Department of Defense commendation. Then she returned to the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee. No ceremony. Just warmth. Joel stayed an hour. He spoke little. When he left, the doorbell chimed again, and no one needed to ask who he was. Word spread, but not through headlines. Instead, people whispered it like a secret worth keeping. That the man who once faded into the snow had come back. That he was volunteering now at the VA center. That he'd enrolled in a counseling course to work with other veterans. That something had been given back to him, something not even the military could provide. Weeks passed, and the town kept changing. At the high school, a new elective was added, modern civics through service. It included field trips to the local VFW, interviews with veterans, and a day at the bakery. At the library, a shelf appeared titled Quiet Courage. It held books about medics, chaplains, and field cooks. And in the front of each was a sticker of a loaf of bread. Clara never attended the town meetings where her story was mentioned. She didn't stand when her name was read aloud at the Memorial Day ceremony. But she did keep showing up for her shifts, wearing the same worn apron, bringing the same thermos, and wrapping each loaf as if it were the first. One morning, she noticed something different in Rhonda. The younger woman had been quiet since the convoy came. But today, She spoke as she placed a cinnamon roll on the counter. "You were right," she said, not making eye contact. "It wasn't small." Clara didn't answer. She just smiled and moved the roll to the warming tray. By spring, the bakery was busier. Not loud, not bustling, just fuller. Veterans sat by the windows. Teens wrote essays by the heater. A photograph had been hung quietly on the wall, Joel, in uniform, standing beside the plaque outside with a small boy on his shoulders. No caption. Just an image that held the story. One evening, the clerk from the hardware store, the same man who once muttered about handouts, was spotted painting the community center stairs. He wore a shirt that read "One loaf, one story." No one mentioned it, but they all noticed. That was how it worked now. Clara still kept the metal hidden. Still read the letters in quiet. Still touch the glass of water she poured each night as though it were something sacred. Because it was. One night, as she stood at the counter watching the snow fall again, she caught her reflection in the window. Behind her, the bakery shelves were full, the coffee was hot, and the tables were occupied by people who, weeks ago, might have walked by without looking in. And she thought, not with pride, but with awe, about how a single loaf of bread had become something more than food. It had become a bridge. A lifeline. A symbol. Not because it solved everything, but because it was offered without asking for anything in return. That was enough. That had always been enough. And in that truth, Beaver Falls had found its healing.